Rich countries have pledged around $500 million to help the most vulnerable countries cope with climate change. A new loss and damage fund will help offset the long-term impact of rising sea levels and extreme weather events, such as flooding, droughts and wildfires. But critics say the money pledged at the COP28 climate conference in Dubai is not enough. In Pakistan, families are still struggling with the aftermath of devastating floods that swept through the Sindh province last year.
A runny potato curry and chapatis are what this family eats most days. It's not a varied diet and not very nutritious, but it's all they can afford. 22-year-old Uzma lives in this mud house with her husband, her 2 children, and several other relatives. She was 8 months pregnant when they had to run for their lives last year, fleeing the flooding that hit their village. The waters left her home in the southern Sindh province inundated for months. Their livestock, a source of food and income, all perished. Even though they are back in their home and are trying to make ends meet, the family hasn't fully recovered.
We struggle to get food. My husband can't find work. Sometimes we can only afford to feed the children. We adults go to bed hungry. When we have the money, we buy some potatoes to feed the children.
This area was one of the worst affected. The waters destroyed 4 million acres of agricultural land throughout Pakistan. Large parts still can't be worked. That's left many farming communities without food and a sustainable source of income. Local aid groups have stepped in and are working with women most in need, teaching them to farm. Salma has been trained to grow her own vegetables on a small piece of land. She manages to grow enough to feed her children and also sell extra produce to make some money.
I'm glad we survived the floods. We lost a lot of our livestock, 12 goats and 2 cows. We became poor. We couldn't buy enough vegetables to feed the whole family. My children were always getting sick. Now I'm able to feed my children properly.
But these local interventions are only a tiny fraction of what is needed. The Pakistani government says it cannot provide large-scale help. It was in one of the worst economic crises in the country's history when the floods hit. They were the worst on record and have been directly linked to climate change. Even though Pakistan emits less than 1% of global greenhouse gases, its people are suffering the direct consequences. That's why the implementation of the Loss and Damage Fund at the UN Climate Conference COP28 offers some hope for these communities. But until the funding is released, millions will have to survive on their own.
Mustafa Talpur is Asia Regional Head of Advocacy and Campaigns for Oxfam International. He joins us from Islamabad. Welcome to DW. So is it the sheer scale of these floods that has made it so difficult to get life back to normal in affected areas?
Yes, that's correct. It was a huge area and scattered across 2 provinces in Pakistan. And it's a vast area, of course. But because this level of flood and its effect, it was a Herculean task to support communities in those areas. And as we saw in 2010 flood, the global community and aid was flowing in. But this time, this aid hasn't really mobilized as it was needed.
Right.
So that is another issue that these communities are still struggling to survive and resettle.
Right. So
and they also missed the rapid.
I'm sorry. So you were saying that the aid hasn't made much of a difference. And again, is that because there isn't enough aid, or is that because, well, there's aid, but it can't get to where it's needed?
It's both. There isn't enough aid, very tiny global international aid was mobilized this time. That's why Pakistan took it to the last COP to have this loss and damage fund kind of concept practiced and put into place.
Right.
So, yeah, and also the government of Pakistan has a less fiscal space. You see, this is a COVID crisis, then Pakistan was hit with an economic crisis and inflation, and then on top of that, we have 2022 flood. So all these combined factors have that impact on the local resource mobilization also to support the people.
I understand.
So less global aid, less domestic resource mobilization and fiscal space to support communities.
Do you expect this new loss and damage fund announced at the start of COP28 then, do you expect that to make much of a difference?
Well, it's a much needed progress. Oxfam and a lot of other aid agencies have been arguing that we need that fund because countries like Pakistan have a negligible contribution into the global climate crisis, but these are the country and the communities in the south of Pakistan, as your reporter was mentioning, are affected the most, and they have the less capacity to address those issues. So this is a welcome space, welcome progress on the loss and damage fund, but we in Oxfam think that this is really a tiny drop in the ocean.
Understood.
In Pakistan, in Pakistan, 2020 flood, there was an assessment by government and the World Bank. So the total loss and damage cost is $30 billion US.
Right.
Only one flood in one country. And if we are talking about 400 million in the loss and damage fund, it's really a tiny amount. But
and so what is this loss and damage fund? What are the funds in this fund supposed to be used for?
I think its mechanism still has to be, we have a less information how it will operationalize and how it will function. But what we propose or what we argue or advocate for is that it must reach to the communities that are affected. It should not have too many intermediaries to decide. So the frontline communities who are affected most of these climate-associated disasters and floods like Pakistan, they should have say in its design, and there should not be many people are intermediary in between, and
Understood.
They must get it. They must get immediately, but that should also be a transparent. So it should be new money.
Thank you.
It should not be repackaging of the old packages of the previous aid commitments.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Mustafa Talpur from Oxfam International.
Thank you for having me.
And DW's climate correspondent Louise Osborne joins me here in the studio for more. Hi, Louise. We just saw there the massive impact that the flooding had on people in Pakistan. What specifically is making it so difficult now to get life back to normal?
I mean, these countries are incredibly vulnerable. So not only are they vulnerable to the impacts of climate change that they've done little to contribute to in terms of burning of fossil fuels, but they are also incredibly vulnerable when it comes to the infrastructure that they already have in place. These are developing countries that are still building up and so are not able to cope with the kind of, deluges of water that we saw, for example, with that those flooding last year.
And it was extraordinary flooding, wasn't it?
It was extraordinary.
It was huge, yeah.
And, I mean, that flooding alone cost around $40 billion. That's estimated by the Pakistani government. And so, they just need help and money to be able to deal with those kinds of impacts that they're seeing.
Mm-hmm. So a huge need for help. Let's talk about this loss and damage fund that's been struck at this year's COP28 climate conference. How significant potentially is that to help people, for example, in this situation that we've just seen?
I mean, it's really significant. Island states have been battling to have some kind of loss and damage fund for the last 30 years. They obviously want money to help with the rising sea levels that are impacting their coastal communities. And this fund was set or announced last year, and this year already it's been adopted. The recommendations for it have been adopted. That was a huge step forward, and I think a big surprise for a lot of experts, definitely for us as well. And that's already through, so that is a big step forward. Experts had thought it would take years to set up, but it looks like it could be a lot sooner than that.
OK, so but let's put into perspective here what it actually means for people affected by climate change, by extreme weather patterns made worse by the changing climate. I mean, when will they actually see this money that's been pledged so far?
So it's really hard to know. They're still at the beginning. There is supposed to be a board that is set up that will assess the kinds of damages that disasters are causing. That will then see that the money is made to, or sent to the countries that need it. But the problem is that that money is still not even slightly enough. I mean, as we heard before, it's about $500 million that has been pledged so far. Loss and damage is estimated to cost around $500 billion by 2030 every year in developing countries alone. So, this is a drop in the bucket in terms of what they're actually going to need. But, experts have said it's a good step forward, it's a show of goodwill, but there needs to be more done, certainly.
Right. DW's climate correspondent Louise Osborne, thank you so much for that update. Thank you.